And I am going to turn it over to Travis, who's been with Family Service and Guidance Center 16 years. Even though he looks like he's 15 years old, he's been with us for 16 years. So I'm going to get out of the way. I'm going to turn off my video and turn off my audio. I'm going to let Travis go through some of the questions, or all of the questions that we got pre-submitted. If any of you have a live question, just hit the little raised hand thing, and Travis will get right to your question. So Travis, I'm going to turn it over to you. Take it.
Sounds good. Thanks everybody for coming. I do have several pre-asked questions. I'm pretty loose with things. If you guys have questions or additional questions off what I'm saying, just ask. Raise your hand, unmute yourself, ask. There's not a large group here, so please just ask questions as we go along. I'll do my best to answer them for you. Just kind of as a precursor, it's hard to get too terribly specific with each individual case we're talking about, so we're going to be more general because I don't know a lot of you. I don't know the certain cases going on, but I'll do my best to answer questions for you in a more general way. And if we have more questions, we can chat afterward and get you in touch with people we need to. So any questions before we get rolling? I guess what we're here is we'll have questions, right? All right, so I will start with the list of questions I have. The first question that was submitted to us was possible ways to help a child in school and academically that's dealing with trauma. So again, it's a bit of a loaded question. A lot of these questions are going to be loaded that come with a lot of covets about what the trauma is, how we're dealing with it. One of the best ways is getting in touch with your school staff, getting in touch with their school counselors, your school social workers, your school principal. Let them know what's going on. Let them know what the trauma is. And the school is going to have those resources for you to help you in most of those situations. Obviously, we have services here at Family Service and Guidance Center, but first work with your school, work with your local school district with what the questions are. Is the school related to, is the trauma related to school? Is the trauma just affecting school? So a lot of the questions that we would ask in the situation is trying to figure out what are the triggers, what classes are we struggling in, trying to identify those specifics of where the struggles are. Of what the struggles are, so you have as much information from your child to go to the school with. And again, in our experiences, we work very closely with schools, and schools are very good in working with these situations as well. So feel free to reach out to the schools in those situations, be very open with them. They're going to keep the information confidential with as few people as needed. They'll reach out to teachers as needed, and it'll kind of go from there. The next question I got was, is it ever fully healed? Great question. And it's a question, again, it's going to depend person to person. In a lot of cases, yes, you can overcome trauma. It depends on what we want to describe as fully healed and overcome as well, though, too, right? Can you get over it to the point where it's not affecting you daily? Yes. Does it still make you sad? Does it still make you anxious sometimes? Yes, that can be completely healed as well in some aspects, because we have to look at the sense of, is the action supposed to make us, did the behavior make us anxious for a certain reason? And is it legitimate anxiety, or is there just kind of this trauma-related anxiety that we're dealing with too? So that's a really good question. So is it ever fully healed? Depends on the person. The sooner we can get to it, the sooner we're addressing it, the more likely we have a chance of overcoming the anxiety and trauma fully. The later we get to it, the more difficult it becomes. Again, we also want to be somewhat cautious of that. If someone's experienced a traumatic event right away, we don't necessarily want to throw them into therapy. We don't want to be processing it that level of degree. We want to give some time, usually 3 to 6 months, to process that on their own, and then we'll jump in and do it. Obviously, if there's other symptoms like suicidal ideation, suicidal behaviors, homicidal behaviors, extreme depression, get in and see somebody as soon as you can, and we'll help you guys with that too. We may not address the trauma right away, because again, we want you and your child to be processing that in a healthy way on your own. What research shows is if we jump in too soon as providers, what can happen is we can cause more harm than good, and we don't let you process it on your own in kind of a natural way. And we're jumping in and forcing you into processing this when your body's not quite ready for it yet. Next question. How can you address trauma caused by viewing adult content online to a 6-year-old? Again, kind of a loaded question, difficult to know without a lot of context, but I'll do my best. So I'll generalize this to just younger kids. We won't just refer it to a 6-year-old, but just younger kids in general. We see situations where younger kids may be forced into watching it. Younger kids may be coerced into watching it by another adult, by an older peer, by an older sibling. And it raises a lot of questions for those youth in a lot of situations. And we want to be taking that seriously. We want to be open with them. You'll hear me say this a lot. Have an open conversation about it. Don't make it taboo, because if you make it taboo, the kid's not going to talk to you about it either. If you are uncomfortable talking about it, seek help. Reach out to your schools, reach out to Family Service and Guidance Center, counselors out in the community that you know are private providers, et cetera, and ask them for assistance. Just because your 6-year-old or 7-year-old may have seen illicit material online, some adult content online, whether that's pornography, whether that's violence, whether that's drug use, whatever it is, doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be traumatized by it. That they may have some anxiety about it, they may have a ton of questions to ask about it. And in those situations, it's best that we address those questions, because if we don't, we have 6-year-old minds, 7-year-old minds making up answers on their own, or we have 7, 8, 9-year-old friends who may be exposed to this stuff, giving them answers that may not be accurate and may not be healthy. So we want, as parents, to be involved in that conversation. As providers, we want to be involved in that conversation. We'll be open about that. Same with sex and drugs and alcohol. We're seeing that kind of stuff on TV. We see that kind of stuff on the media all the time. We hear about that. We hear about suicide on the media. We want to have a conversation with our children about it. If you see them looking a little anxious about it, it's okay to hit the pause button and say, hey, let's talk about this. Let's talk about what this means. Let's have this conversation. Don't let mental health be taboo in the house. Don't let these topics be taboo, because if they become taboo, your children don't talk to you about them and they get their information from their peers, which, as we all know, being kids, at one point, sometimes our peers may not give us the best information about things like sex and drugs and whatever else is going on in their lives. Any follow-up questions on that one? That's a common one we see quite a bit. All right. Next question we have. Is there a way to see behavior as a result of trauma, or because it is simply the age and stage of the child? Great question. So a lot of times we start looking at it as trauma when we see a significant change in behavior from what they were before. Does it go hand in hand sometimes? Sure. If a kid's hitting puberty and experiencing a traumatic event, it can be really hard to distinguish the two. But usually you can tell by the degree of the change. So if your child is going along just fine, they turn 12 and the behaviors happen about the same time a traumatic event happened, we're going to look at when the traumatic event happened. We're going to look at the behaviors before and after the traumatic event, during the traumatic event, and we're going to kind of assess it in that way. As a parent, that's a great way to look at it yourself as well. Parent, school teacher, whatever we have here, that's really a good way to look at it is what was the cause of the trauma? Is it trauma? Another thing to really talk about too is, like I said in the videos, and I don't know if you all saw the videos that were posted on Facebook, but just because of something that we would assume it being traumatic doesn't necessarily mean it's going to traumatize us or our child or someone else. That goes both ways. Just because of something that we think isn't traumatic doesn't mean it's not going to affect our child that way. I've had kids I've worked with that have legitimate trauma from rape, from abuse, from things like that, down to being exposed to their dog passing away. And that can be very traumatic. And it wasn't just being sad and depressed about it. It was a very traumatic experience for this youth I worked with that he struggled with for months. It was a huge loss to him. It was his first big loss. Learning to cope with that was traumatic for him. Well, we have some kids go through both sides of that spectrum, and there's not traumatizing to them. It doesn't affect them in that way because the different makeup, the different background they have, the different raising they've had. It's not saying parents are raising them wrong or right. It's just how it affects each individual person, their chemical makeup, their brain makeup, etc. You can have two kids in the same house experience domestic abuse. One can be traumatized by it, one might not be. So things to think about. Let's not push trauma and just say, hey, you had a traumatic event, you experienced something that was awful, it scared me, so you should be traumatized by it. If we do that, we cause trauma in our kid. So again, have an open conversation about it, assess from behaviors, see what those behaviors look like. Are we isolating? Are we withdrawing? Are we becoming angry? Are we becoming more aggressive when certain situations come up? And try and identify and isolate when those situations are, because that will help people like myself or case managers or school staff know what those triggers are for your kid, and will help us tie that back into the trauma. The next question we had, it says, moving forward with our lives after enduring a traumatic battle with COVID. Everyone wants to know about COVID right now. I think it's important to know we're not done with that traumatic battle with COVID yet. It's back. It's higher than it's ever been in Kansas. The rates are still climbing in Shawnee County. We're back in that red and that lovely chart that we love to see every week that comes out. It's bad news. It's a lot of anxiety associated with COVID that we're seeing with kids right now, especially in our crisis department. So I work in our crisis department, and we get kids coming in ever since kids started going back to school. we've had a lot of trauma, a lot of anxiety about kids struggling getting to school. You'll hear me say trauma and anxiety both a lot today. They go hand in hand. They're tied in together a lot. They are separate in some ways, but trauma is a kind of anxiety as well. We've had kids struggling with, again, if you saw the videos, you'll hear some of the common things I said, kids struggling with the loss of a loved one during COVID and not being able to cope with that because they weren't able to go to a funeral. And we have parents struggling with that. We have kids struggling with not being able to see their loved ones for months, a year at a time because we were quarantined, because we were on lockdown. We were worried about our loved ones and spreading COVID. We only saw them over the phone, which is so different because we don't have that physical touch, right? I know personally with my kids, it was very challenging for them to not have Christmas or birthdays or Easter or whatever with grandparents on either side of the family because they didn't get that touch. While we got to see them over Zoom or over Duo or whatever app we wanted to use, it just wasn't the same because you didn't get the hug from grandma. You didn't get the pat on the back from grandpa. You didn't get to sit on grandpa's lap. You didn't get to see them and have a face-to-face conversation with them. And that was very difficult for all of us. It was difficult for me as an adult to go through and not see parents and not see grandparents and go through all that. So we're still digging our way out of this COVID battle. And again, one of the most important things you can do is be consistent, have a conversation with your kids about it. Know what's bothering them, talk to them about it. COVID was scary. COVID is still scary for a lot of people. It's scary for people who are vulnerable, people who know people who are in a vulnerable population, people who have been in the hospital, long-term effects of COVID. It's real, it's here. We don't want to beat around the bush. We want to have the conversation. We want to be open. We want to be honest. We want to talk freely to our children about this. Again, if this is something that you struggle with too, make sure you're in a good place before you talk to your child about it. Again, it's hard to say because we're still digging out of the mist of COVID. We don't know what the future brings for it. We could be in this for another year. We could be this another 2 years. We're still dealing with this. And it's just learning to adapt to a new world. And as an agency, as a field, we're still adapting to this too. What I'm seeing a lot of, like I said, is a lot of anxiety going back to school, a lot of trauma going back to school, kids having a hard time wearing masks because they feel claustrophobic. They feel like they're not safe at school. A lot of kids having panic attacks because they don't feel safe at school because they might get sick. And that anxiety all comes back in, led on from the trauma of what has been COVID-19. Be cautious with media at all times. It doesn't just go with COVID-19, this goes for everything. If your kids are watching the news with you, be aware the news isn't very friendly. The news shares a lot of information. No matter where you stand on the political spectrum, you're going to agree with some, you're going to disagree with some. We won't go too far into that tonight. That could be a rabbit hole we don't want to chase. But you're going to hear stuff that's factual. You're going to hear stuff that's not factual. Get the facts, give good information to your children, and again, follow up with them. If your kids are watching the news with you and something traumatic comes up, you're talking about a suicide, you're talking about war, you're talking about when 9/11 happened, have a conversation with your kids about it. Again, if it's one of those things that's being well spoke about, like when 9/11 occurred, it was one of those things we would want people to talk to our children about right away. I can remember being in high school when this happened and not really having anyone to process it with and being very confused about why it happened and trying to process that on my own. Having people talk to me about it in school was very helpful. Having teachers talk to us about it in history class and what that meant to the impact of the world, not just us, but individually, even though it was miles away from us across the country, it still affected all of us in a different way. And so being able to debrief with people instead of just getting the information from my peers or making conclusions on my own as a 16-year-old, 17-year-old child makes a big difference. The next question we have, how to explain traumatic events to toddlers and preschoolers? Another great question. And this is again a tricky one. So you guys are asking great questions. This is one we want to be really careful with because we don't want to assume that it was traumatic to the toddler or the preschooler. If we have a really young child who's experienced something traumatic, we want to look at their behaviors. We want to look at their behaviors to see if they're describing the things that I talked about in the videos, more crying, more sadness, more isolation, avoiding certain things, maybe talking about it. Most young kids we work with aren't going to talk about it directly. They're going to show you through their behaviors, through their play, through their actions. So you might see the way they play with toys be a little more aggressive or a little bit different. If it was sexual trauma, or they heard about sexual trauma, you might see them playing that way with their toys. Again, we want to intervene as providers and parents and talk to them about that in a healthy way. While talking about sex with a 6-year-old may not be something we really want to do, if they've been exposed to it, we want them to have a healthy view of what sex is, of what a positive relationship with mom is, a positive relationship with dad is, depending on what it was, what the trauma was. So again, have a conversation, but don't instill your worries and don't instill new worries on the kid. So if you think your child has been traumatized, don't assume they've been traumatized until you start to see the change in behaviors, or they're telling you they're really scared about it, they're really worried about it. Then we can start, those red flags start flying. Okay, we need to slow down and have a conversation about this. Too many times do we cause more problems than we should by trying to address a problem that doesn't really exist, or as parents, and I've been guilty of this myself too, putting our anxiety on our own children about a situation that happened and saying, hey, we should talk about this. We saw a lot of this with a lot of the racial tensions going on during COVID, and kids coming in trying to talk about this and process this. And as an agency, we really took a step back and slowed down and said, hey, how are we going to address this with the community? How are we going to address this with kids coming in our groups, in our crisis center? How do we address this in a way that we aren't causing problems, but we're just being open and honest about what the reality is? And we took a very educational approach to it and didn't use opinionated approaches to it. It's very difficult to do, but you have to educate them, and really starts with education of those situations. But again, the key is not to assume they've been traumatized just because they saw something or something had happened to them. And Jim put something down in the chat. He says, if anyone needs a certificate of attendance, please send him a message in the chat. Bear with me. I'm looking for the next question. I lost track of my questions here. So best ways to handle crisis moments aside from staying calm. So this is what I do for a living. I work in a crisis department and I love it. I've worked here in crisis for 6 years. I've worked at Family Service and Guidance Center for 16, and crisis situations have always been enjoyable to me in a weird way because I get in this weird, calm, zen state. Again, the first thing you need to do is stay calm. Even if that's from someone being angry, someone being traumatized, or being a wreck, whatever it is that you're seeing, whatever it is that's going on. First things first, make sure you're safe. Make sure everyone around you that you need to take care of is safe. And then you got to keep yourself under control and be calm about it. It's very difficult. It's very challenging. And that really is the best advice I can give. If you can stay calm, you're going to have the interventions that you need in the given situation. If you can stay calm and present yourself as calm to your child and everybody else around you, your child's anxiety drops significantly. I know we've all been there. Something has happened. We've lost a loved one. We've almost gotten in a car wreck. We've talked about something in front of our kids that maybe we shouldn't have. And our kids have a million questions about it. We're like, oh no, they're feeding off my anxiety or my trauma about the situation. I've been there. I've got 3 kids and I've probably done it to every one of them at some point. And what we do in those situations, we go back in and we try and fix it. We go in as a calm, when we're calm. There's times when I'm not able to do it. So I'll call someone else to help. Maybe it's my wife. If we don't have a significant other, maybe it's a grandparent. Maybe it's a good friend of the family. Maybe it's a school teacher. Maybe it's a school counselor. Get help from that area if you can't handle it yourself. And there's no shame in that. You don't have to handle all that on your own. As a parent, you have support systems and the schools there to support you. Family Service and Guidance Centers here to support you. So reach out and we're here to help. So I guess other ways to handle it as instead of staying calm, just naturally staying calm, you're going to be able to think more clear. And that's really why I say stay calm, and staying calm is the key. Because in a crisis situation, if you can stay calm, the front part of your brain is still functioning well. You're able to think logically, you're able to reason through things. If you're not calm, the back part of your brain is all that's firing, and that's fight or flight. That's, am I safe? That's, we're not processing things. We might get angry really easily. We might get sad really easily. And that's going to change every way you look at it to think more logically and more realistically. It really is the best thing you can do in order to stay calm in those situations. It might be finding those coping skills, whether it's deep breathing, whether it's meditation in the moment, whatever you need. Find what works for you, whether it's walking away and distracting yourself. We do that a lot of times with our staff and our clients in crisis situations, whether it's trauma related or not. We will get clients to go for a walk with a staff member when they're getting aggressive as a result of reliving their trauma or whatever it is. We'll get them to go play a game of ping pong or foosball, or just go downstairs and isolate one-on-one with somebody and just lay down for 5 minutes. Get them a snack. Regulate those types of things. Go back to your basic life rules, playing a video game, whatever it is, and then we process it. If we're trying to process it in the moment of the crisis, we're going to fail. We're going to say things we shouldn't have. Our children aren't going to respond the way they want to. So you want your child to become more processing these things too. So the key would be to calm your child down before we really start talking about whatever it was that occurred. How to help the child realize and deal with trauma. So this is going to be more targeted probably toward our older kids. I would say probably 10 and up are the more likely ones that are going to be able to realize their trauma. What's really hard is when you have kids that are refusing to identify as trauma, because identifying as trauma, one, makes them feel weak, and two, traumatizes them, right? We see that a lot in our crisis center. We see that a lot with our clients, just in outpatient as well. It's really difficult. The other thing we see is parents being affected by their child's trauma and struggling with their own trauma associated with that, or a child struggling with their parent's trauma and being traumatized because the parent's been traumatized, and that's kind of fed off. That's normal to happen. It's not saying anyone's done bad parenting. It's not saying anyone's done good parenting. It's normal. It's just how humans interact. It's how humans function. So bear that in mind if you're in that situation and your child has gotten trauma from you, or you've gotten trauma from your child just from feeding off each other. We live together. It's going to happen. Kind of like I said earlier, we've all done it. We've all been there. We've all had situations like that happen. So to help them realize and deal with the trauma, again, you want to name the monster that is trauma. You want to identify what the trauma is. You want them to know that everybody experiences some type of trauma, from a pet passing away to a car accident to murder to suicide to other things that we see that we don't like to see, we don't like to hear, but they need to know. We need to normalize it and make them think that trauma isn't this horrible, awful thing that people can't get through and that people can't talk about. Normalizing trauma and mental health in general is so important to our kids. A lot of times we forget to talk about that. We forget to talk about suicide. We forget to talk about anxiety. We forget to talk about trauma. And when we forget to talk about that, our kids feel like it's not normal for us to talk to us about that. So when we start bringing that up at age 15, 16, 17 years old for the first time, they kind of withdraw. So we want to teach them early. We want to talk to them early about these things. It's not like you have to go to your children and say at 7 and 8 years old or 9 and 10 years old and say, hey, this is what trauma is. But as those experiences come up, we don't even have to label it as trauma necessarily. We can label it as, hey, this is a really difficult thing. How do you do it? Grandpa passed away. Let's have a talk. Hey, we got a really scary car wreck. You got hurt really bad. Let's have a conversation about that, right? Hey, you got kidnapped from dad, from mom, from grandma, from uncle, from somebody you don't even know. Let's talk about how that was, right? That's how, were you scared? Because I was scared, right? Have that conversation. Be open about your emotions about it and normalize it so your child doesn't feel like they're isolated in that. One of the biggest issues we see is that for most kids, it's not normalized. It's taboo to be traumatized. It's not normal to be traumatized. It's not normal for this to happen to you. And while these things can be things that don't happen to most people in society, everyone's experienced some kind of trauma from one degree to another. And it affects all of us, whether we want to realize it or not. And so making that conversation, just be open with your kids about it. Be open with your students about it. Have that conversation and just say, hey, let's talk, because I see you being bothered by this. Let's have a conversation. What's really hard is when you have an older kid who's shutting down and just not identifying it as trauma. When you hit the nail on the head, what happens a lot of time is you will get a rapid change of subject from that youth or from that adult or whoever you're working with or talking to. I call it slamming the door in your face. As therapists, what we do is we put our foot in that door and we're going to inch it open slowly, right? As a parent, I'd encourage the same thing. We don't want to open the floodgates. I'm not going to slam the door open. I'm just going to put my foot there and let them sit with it for a bit and think about it for a bit. And over time, maybe months, maybe weeks, maybe minutes, we don't know. Depends on the trauma, depends on the person. The floodgates will start to open a little bit more. We can talk about it. Being able to identify as trauma, which is why I love this question, is important, because a lot of kids will just identify as it's just something that happened to me. No, this isn't normal. This isn't something that just happened to you. It's something we need to talk about, right? So great question. The next question is it best to face the trauma Or if they seem to have buried it, don't dig at it. Kind of answered that one already, right? If you feel like you have to dig and dig and dig, please seek help. If you're digging and we're digging in a way that's not productive, we're digging in a way that's not strength-based, you're going to have to dig more and more, and it's going to become more and more buried. Your child's digging right with you and burying it more, or your loved one, or whoever you're working with. So be mindful of that. If you have to dig and dig, ask for professional assistance. The value of this it's not just that you can't do it, it's that you are also very emotionally involved in this, which is why trauma works so well with a therapist who's a third party. Well, we do get emotionally involved. We do our best not to, right? If it's my children, it's a whole different situation than if it's your child or someone else's child. Do I still care? Absolutely. That's why I do this job. But if it's my child, I'm not going to treat it. I'm not going to address it directly for those bigger issues that are hidden that we're digging on. I'm going to find someone in the field to do it for me so I can have an unbiased third-party person do it. Hope that makes sense. So is it best to face the trauma? Really tricky question, right? To a degree, yes. We need to face the trauma. We need to address that. But if we're really having to dig a lot, let's get some help. Let's call the school counselor in. Let's talk to Family Service and Guidance Center, call into our hotlines, to our crisis line. We get a lot of calls for those types of situations in crisis. We end up starting kids and services, and we kind of take it from there. So be mindful. If you feel like you're having to dig a lot, it's okay to ask for help. All right, the next question. My 10-year-old granddaughter's father died over a year ago, and she still does not want her mom to go anywhere without her and sleeps with her. What steps do you recommend to help my granddaughter get back to normal? So this sounds like some pretty significant separation anxiety, right? Probably induced by the traumatic situation that happened. Anxiety is a beast. It's brutal. A lot of the same steps that we're going to talk about. Identify it, name what the monster is, identify why the child won't leave the side of mother or grandmother or whoever it is. Help them get through that situation through that. Family Service and Guidance Center, again, not trying to promote it, but there's an anxiety treatment program here, and it is an amazing program. They walk through step by step. Our job is to get you in and out as fast as we can. We teach parents how to do our job, essentially, as anxiety providers, and parents go in, they start taking care of those problems, and we move on to the next step. Separation anxiety is probably something you want some help with. And again, the sooner, the better. It happened just over a year ago in this instance. We want to make sure that's plenty of time to process it. That's plenty of time to talk about it. Sounds like we're still struggling. So we don't want to develop other symptoms as a result of it, which often happens of trauma. And it sounds like of this traumatic event, we developed some separation anxiety. So it would make sense to get with someone to help you walk through step by step what to do. Essentially, just kind of in a nutshell, what would happen is we'd work on, one, identifying why it's happening. Two, we'd work on pulling them apart, right? In different situations. We've got an adorable little one joining us on camera. So hello to her. Thanks for that wonderful image, Nick. Appreciate that. But back to the anxiety piece, we work on it step by step. We're going to come up with what we call a hierarchy, and we're going to list the things that make them anxious. Maybe it's sleeping in their own rooms at 10 on a scale of 0 to 10, 10 being the worst. Maybe sleeping and not touching mom with a pillow between the two. So we start there. Then we slowly move away. We slowly move away from that. We slowly build up to get further and further away. My question to that would be, are there other situations? Is it just sleeping with mom? Are there problems going to school? Are there problems going to the grocery store without your daughter? Are there problems going to grandparents' house or someone else's house with mom not there? Those are a lot of questions that you'll have to wrap your mind around for whoever asked that question. And again, if you have more questions, feel free to chime in and I can get more specific about it. But a lot of details that play into how that works. So I hope that's a good general question. So how to manage your own emotional crisis when your child triggers your PTSD. Bear with me 1 second, guys. I do work in crisis and my phone is blowing up and I'm on call all the time, just making sure it's not crisis related. So we're good. I apologize. So again, the question was, how do you manage your own emotional crisis when your child triggers your PTSD? Man, kids are good at that, aren't they? A lot of times we see kids doing it on purpose because they can get a parent into a crisis situation. And that can roll into them getting kind of what they want, because when we start experiencing that traumatic situation, we can kind of shut down. We don't really know how to handle things. We might get really angry, and the kids kind of like, okay, mom and dad are going to leave me alone tonight. I can go do what I want. I can play video games all night. I can go to Johnny's house because mom's done. I can go to Sally's house because dad's done with me. Cool. It's a reality of things. It is a difficult situation. So first things first, if you are getting triggered and you are struggling with PTSD, seek professional help. That's going to be your first step. And it going to depend on what's triggering you, how they're triggering you. If it's not intentional and it's just happening occasionally, like when your kid has an outburst or whatever it is, or your kid brings something up to you for talking about their own trauma that they experienced, or you guys have a shared traumatic experience. Something we see as well, when a child and an adult have experienced abuse from the same person or have witnessed abuse from the same person. A child witnesses dad being abused or mom being abused or whoever it is. That we see a lot, and we trigger each other. And what we have to be careful of is when we're triggering each other, as a parent, we need to be the one stepping up and saying, hey, we can't talk about this right now. Don't put that anxiety on your child. Don't talk to your child too much about your anxiety, especially when you're in the midst of it, because you're focusing back here on that part of your brain that's fight or flight, and you're going to say things you regret, say things you don't, that are helpful for your child, say things that probably scare your child more. You get to reminiscing about it. And what's really hard is in that situation, a lot of times we're looking for an ally. We're looking for someone to go to us, support us. And if you don't want that to be your child, if you make that your child, you're going to put your child in a situation where they feel like they have to take care of you, which is why in the videos, I said it's so important to control your own emotions. So first things first, seek your own treatment through Vallejo, who works with adults, or find a private provider. You can come to us. We'll help you find a private provider. Go through that simple direction. If your child is involved in it too, look for therapy for both. Look for a family therapist in the community. Come to us. We'll help you guys. That's what we do. That's what we're here for. The last question I have is being removed from the home and how it affects a child. So I have to tie this back in to what I said earlier. Being removed from the home is going to affect one kid different than another. It can affect two kids in the same house. It can affect twins in the same house very differently. So it's hard to say, right? So if a child's been removed from the home, it's good to talk about it. I don't know if this was sent in from someone who had their children removed from the home, or if this was sent in from someone who maybe was in a separation and they lived with a different parent. I don't know if this was sent in from someone who works in foster care. We get all three of those situations. And it's a different situation. It depends on why they're removed. It depends on what's going on. But again, I have to go back to, let's be honest. Let's talk about the situation. Let's talk about why it's happening. So this is a very tricky situation. I don't want to jump too far down the rabbit hole on this one because depending on the specific situation, I can get myself in a pretty tough spot pretty quickly here. So what I will say is be open, be honest in the vast majority of situations. If you are that person in the unfortunate situation where your children are being removed from your home, that's got to be difficult. I couldn't imagine what that would be like. But if that is the case, we want to be careful about how we address this, because you're going to be upset about it. You're going to think it's not fair. And it might not be, it might be. I don't know, because I don't know the certain situations, which is that rabbit hole I'm trying not to jump down, right? So be mindful of that. Be mindful and keep the focus on your children and your children's mental health, not the complaints about what's happening. Be honest with them. Be open with them about what's going on if you can. Find someone else to talk to them about it too. This is why a third party in these situations is so important and so good, because it really is a traumatic thing. Being removed, heck, my 11-year-old daughter being away from the home for 2 nights in a row is too much for her, right? She struggles with anxiety. She struggles with being away from home for a little bit of time, and she's gotten better and better as she's gotten older. But being away from home even with her grandparents for 2 days is a challenge for her. She gets homesick so quickly, which as a parent, I love, because she wants to come back and give hugs and snuggle. It's wonderful. But also as a parent, it's kind of like, oh, I feel bad for you because your anxiety. Let's talk about it. Let's have a conversation. So we all deal with these things. With my kids and the kids we work in crisis, we're very open. We're very direct about these types of situations. We talk about it from there. So those are all the questions I have that were sent in to Jim. prior to the training. So what questions do you all have? If any, feel free to type them in, feel free to unmute and put them in, follow-up questions about anything. What can we do for you guys in the last 20 minutes or so?
I was going to say, if you want to send a question to Travis, you can send him a message in the chat just to him, not to everybody. So don't feel like you can't submit a question because you don't want everyone to know who it is. You can send a question just to Travis in the chat if you would like to ask a question. So let's give that a couple seconds.
And depending on the question, if it is something that would take a little bit more explanation, what I'll do is I'll respond back to you and just kind of ask for your email address, and we can address it over email, or I can call at a later time, later, probably next week or something like that if we need to follow up.
Okay. All right. Well, while if someone's submitting a question, that's great. I'm going to go ahead and just kind of start my little wrap-up spiel. And then if we do get a question, Travis, you can take care of it. If you do need a certificate of attendance, please send me a message in the chat. I would be happy to get that out to you. Again, if you want to watch part of tonight's presentation, or if you know of someone who might, let them know that it will be on our website, fsgctopeka.com. And just click the big blue box that says Parenting Resources. That's where the video will be. Travis, we do have a question. I wanted to turn that over to you.
Yes. So Adam asks, he sent it to everybody so we can see it. It says, if you have multiple kids with varying needs, how do you make sure everyone feels loved and included? I love this question. I have 3 children, and they are all vastly, vastly different. Just for a quick descriptor, my 11-year-old is my anxious girl. She rarely does anything to get herself in trouble. She's very well behaved. My 7-year-old is always doing something to get herself in trouble. She's the middle child. And my 3-year-old boy is just a monster. He thinks he's a dinosaur half the time. He thinks he's a truck, and he's a blast to be around. He's constantly loud and constantly pushing any sister's buttons he can, right? And so when something comes up, sometimes we talk about it as a family. Sometimes we talk about it individually. So gauging your children's reaction in that situation. So let's say a loved one passes away. Grandpa passes away, right? A father of a parent passes away. Very, very difficult to I'm looking ahead at Mary's direct question. Well, Mary has a question. I'll get to you later, Mary. Very, very difficult to handle that situation, right? But if you see your kid responding in different ways, it's okay to have separate conversations with them, right? I'm going to have a different conversation with an 11-year-old than I am a 3-year-old. And that's something to keep in mind. The conversation is going to vary between the different kids. My conversation with a 3-year-old is going to be much more through play. It's going to be while I'm probably playing with my child. It's going to be while I'm playing with trucks, and I'm pretending to be one of the Paw Patrol characters because that's my job when I get home. I am constantly a Paw Patrol character. And why I love it, I learned so much about my child through playing with him. I learned about his friends. I learned about how he interacts with others. I learned about how he shares. He's learned to share through play. And so it's such a wonderful and loving thing to see. I'm not going to do that with my 11-year-old, right? My 11-year-old can sit down and process it with me, and she's going to think about it in a different way. When a loved one passes away, or we experience a traumatic event together, there's a tornado, there's a car wreck, whatever the case may be, I'm going to sit down with her and have a more adult conversation with her, right? Because my 11-year-old can handle that. It's going to depend on the individual kid too. My 7-year-old, while she says she doesn't get anxious, she does. And it comes out in different ways. It comes out in anger. It comes out in embarrassment and defiance. And so I have to do it in spurts with her, right? So have a little conversation, let her process it. Have a little conversation, let her process it. Have a little conversation, let her process it. And typically what happens, she'll come back to me and have a conversation later. So it's knowing your kids' needs individually. If they're all close to the same age, it becomes a little bit easier. My kids are all about 4 years apart. And so I'm going to address it differently with them in different situations based on their needs. Again, if a loved one passes away, I'm going to talk to all my kids about it. My 3-year-old is probably not going to be as affected by it because the way he processes it is going to be different. He's probably not going to remember the event. He's not going to know what it means. He's not going to understand that, most likely. He might. I don't know. And we'll figure out if and when that comes. And it's just one of those things to know that each one of your kids is going to process it differently. Even if they're both 11 years old or 11 and 10, they can process it vastly, vastly differently. I hope that helps answer your question, Adam. I'll take a thank you as a yes.
Travis, I'm just wondering, it sounds like you've got another question that you'd kind of like to handle offline.
Yeah.
Is that okay? Is that right?
Yeah. Well, I got a direct message, so I didn't know if that was intended to be individual. I got to take it that way unless I hear otherwise. So I can get with that individual.
Does anybody else have another question for Travis? Take advantage of it.
Travis, that's fine. You can answer it in front of everybody. Oh. You're good.
Awesome. I kind of figured, Mary. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing good.
I love seeing your name on stuff.
Oh, thanks.
Makes me proud.
I saw your name pop up and I was like, oh, well, I know her. So Mary works in the school, for those of you who don't know. Mary asked a question. She goes, can trauma experience as an infant affect children years later? Absolutely. We know trauma can affect kids as far as in utero, right? We see things like fetal alcohol syndrome. We see things like trauma in the womb. I had a young man I worked with, and he had trauma in the womb. He was born with a twin brother who was stillborn because of abuse that happened to mom by biological dad. One sibling died. And this is something that affected him. It affected his brain. It affected how he functions. It caused seizures for his life. There's a lot of things like that we see that affects in utero. So absolutely, trauma can affect a child from beyond birth on. You might not see it right away. You might not see a trauma that affects a 7 or 8 year old until they're 15 or 16. And they're like, oh, shoot, this happened. We see that a lot. So Mary, it's such a great question. Absolutely. Being trauma informed is so important from the time that baby is conceived on, knowing what we can do to help with those situations. We don't have to be so hypervigilant that we're trying to avoid situations so much that we're not going to traumatize them. But in short, the answer of can trauma experienced as an infant affect children years later, the answer is absolutely correct. Yes, it can. We never know when it's going to rear its ugly head or if it's going to rear its ugly head. And we don't know what it's going to look like either.
Anybody else? Well, I'll tell you what, rather than sit here and we can all sit here in awkward silence, why don't we go ahead? If folks want to head out, I want to thank you all for sharing part of your evening with us. Hopefully you got something that you can take and use. Even if you didn't ask a question tonight, maybe you got something that you can use with your kids. Our topic, real world parenting topic next month is going to be depression. And that doesn't really sound like it is kind of a buzzkill, but it's very common in kids. And the thing is, in particular, I think Travis would back me up, as kids get older and into the teen years, you're not sure if it's your kid being moody or if they are really truly depressed or anxious. And I think Dana Thomas, who is one of our outstanding clinicians here, is going to talk about the topic of depression. What is depression? What can cause it? Keep an eye out for our YouTube videos that we'll post up on our Facebook page. On Facebook, that's usually where Facebook pages are. But keep an eye out for those because, again, we'll talk about what is depression, what does it look like for kids of different ages, and what can you as a parent do, and what resources do you already have that might be able to help them with. Our next Q&A is Thursday, February 24th. And on behalf of all of us, thank you guys so much for turning out. Hope you got something out of it, and I wish you all a good evening. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Travis.
Thanks. No problem. Thank you guys for attending.
Thanks, folks.